Nå skal jeg trade live. Vi snakkes i kveld. Ikke putt noe mer penger opp der før du ser at du får penger tilbake. Er det greit? Greit, da. Ok, ha det. Now I know only God.
Allocations to China, whether existing or sort of future changes. So I think sort of from a secular perspective, difficult to know how obviously this is all going to play out in terms of increased tensions around Taiwan. But what we're already seeing with our client base now is just much more of an evaluation of their emerging markets allocation, whether they should, think about benchmark construction differently, maybe think about excluding China from the benchmark. So we're already seeing in some ways the secular theme playing out, today in terms of the cyclical.
It feels like very quickly this is becoming an inflation story. Tiffany, is that how you view it from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so I think any crisis
Follow Horn
trends
Italiano.
that were already happening. So obviously we had the pandemic, we have the war in Ukraine, and that's just
Hva skjedde med fete nordmenn? Der sitter jeg svært sjeldent.
supply chain
Orker
resilience.
ikke pendle til Tønsberg, ass.
Reaching for resilience in the past. My esteemed colleague Rich, who's coming on later, will talk about the aftershocks. But certainly these trends have accelerated. And absolutely, reaching for resilience means not a focus on efficiency, and it also means higher costs. So I think over a secular horizon, average inflation above where we saw it at least pre-pandemic is a very reasonable scenario with probably more volatility around that.
Looking forward, I think this conversation shifts to the extremes really quickly, particularly around China. Military conflict won, and you guys have pushed back against that and said that you don't need that. It could still be important and possibly important for the inflation outlook as well. But then you go to dollar reserve currency, you go to treasuries being sold, and everyone starts freaking out really quickly. Are you saying that I should be worried about the US dollar, the currency reserve status, Libby? Should I be worried about the treasury holdings over in China? This goes back to the investor conversation I was having to open this segment. What should I be worried about? Investors don't seem to know what to do with this.
Yeah, so in terms of the reserve currency, again, we talked a lot about this as well, and I think that the sort of the consensus, and which we would agree with, is that you can't replace something with nothing, right? And so you're kind of going back even to the Larry Summers quote in terms of, what are the alternatives? And I'll go even back up to Bill Gross, our founder, when he talked about sort of the U.S. being the cleanest dirty shirt, and I think that was true as of 10 years ago.
It's true now.
It's true now. Now, in terms of sort of U.S.-China relationships, the U.S. policy outlook, I think we talked about the 2024 election as well. That is in some ways irrespective of who's in the White House. What we're seeing play out in Washington, D.C. as it relates to China policy, we think the direction of travel here is clear. It is bipartisan. It will be sort of independent of who's in the White House. So sort of to your earlier question in terms of kind of our outlook, we think, regardless of what the sort of political landscape here is in the United States, this will be a prevailing kind of theme in terms of kind of Capitol Hill. But as it relates to the reserve currency, no, I think, the consensus, generally in the marketplace, the consensus at PIMCO is that the reserve currency is intact. Again, the U.S., that kind of the cleanest dirty shirt paradigm, if you will.
Within the piece, you talk about potentially the end of fiscal activism coming out of the pandemic, but then I noted the trifecta of fiscal issues, policies that we've had over the last 12 months, 18 months. We've done a lot still. Tiffany, why is it necessarily going to be the end of fiscal activism in Washington, D.C. if we can all agree on this massive tension, if it's the one part where we have some bipartisan agreement in Washington, D.C., why can't we do more on this front?
Well, I think inflation is going to be a big constraint here. Obviously we have a lot of debt that's caused some consternation on the Hill, as Libby has talked about. But really, you're right. We have a lot in the pipeline. But I think moving forward, we shouldn't expect to see more. And I think this really matters over our cyclical horizon, where we see a potential recession, and you're just not going to get the policy response that we've expected, kind of in the recent past. Certainly not the policy response like the pandemic, but also not like 2008. So from a broader macro implications point of view, that just means that maybe we have a recession. We still think it's going to be shallow, but there's always the potential it's going to be deep, and you just don't get that policy response. So you accelerate back into something that's still below trend and still kind of sluggish.
Yeah, so I was just going to add to that. I mean,
Sure.
we thought one of the sort of the biggest outcomes of the 2022 election was that this idea of sort of the fiscal put, Congress sort of providing some sort of floor to the economy, was withdrawn, sort of taken off the table under split government. And we think that sort of cyclical theme will actually prevail into the secular, and Rich will talk about this, just in terms of that kind of fiscal activism on both sides of the aisle, interestingly, right? Republicans are going to want to cut back spending, but Democrats, if they should take...
Nei, ok, tredjevalget tjente masse penger I går.
They're going to really want to focus on the revenue side. So we think this is going to be a theme not only over the next 2 years, as Tiffany said, that there's no sort of more fiscal put in the short term, but also over the long term as well.
Just quickly on the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not sure about the title. I think a lot of people are not sure about the name of the bill. Do you think that's going to start to have a positive impact on growth, Tiffany, in the months to come, in the quarters to come?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the bipartisan infrastructure bill actually has the potential to get money into the economy a little bit faster. You know, the IRA and some of the energy credits and things like that, I think that is going to be a more secular story. And I do think that there is the potential for it to be bigger than, you know, what the CBO or other forecasters have estimated. But there's a lot of uncertainty around this, and a lot of this is dependent on energy prices. You really need these credits to incentivize green energy, and so the relative price of fossil fuels is going to matter here. So there's a lot of uncertainty around this. We think it builds over time. Yeah, it'll provide a little bit of support in the near term, but these are still nascent industries, these green energies. They need time to grow, to really impact broader macroeconomic outcomes.
Libby, how are you thinking about that at the moment?
Yeah, so we, just from what we hear from, companies that we're investing in, that permitting reform was really key in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's actually something that we just saw from a debt ceiling perspective, that they deserve a down payment on energy permitting reform. I think our expectations for really kind of this bipartisan to prevail are pretty low, but that is one area we could actually see from a policy perspective. So we've just heard this time and time again. For the IRA to really be effective, we need to have comprehensive both federal and state permitting reform. We do think we got at least a first step of down payment on that in terms of the debt ceiling.
A big feature of the overall conversation in the aftershock economy, I think, has been the post-pandemic labour market, and wondering whether that normalises. Given what we're talking about here, Tiffany, do we have the specialised knowledge to meet the moment, to meet these kind of initiatives in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the potential for some labour market disruption, not just with these issues, but obviously that we haven't even talked about yet. And that's going to create, not only is that going to change how people work, it's going to create a lot of new jobs that we probably haven't even imagined yet. And I think we're clearly on the precipice of that. I think near term, it's still, just from a cyclical perspective, we have industries that have underhired relative to where they were pre-pandemic. This is the government, for example. This is education. This is healthcare. Some of these service industries that are still having trouble getting workers. So that is going to be ultimately a near-term tailwind for the labor market. But it also means that wage inflation is still probably going to be sticky. And so, this is going to, obviously lead into cyclical discussions around the Federal Reserve and how tight monetary policy has to be.
And this is going to be a big conversation for us coming up shortly. Tiffany, Libby, good to see you both.
Thanks,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
You mentioned the former Fed Vice Chair, Richard Clarida. He joins us next on this programme. Your opening bell just around the corner.
Der ja, den traff vi bra.
Why does everybody want to be a consultant, and what are all these consultants doing?
Well, David, I think that we actually defy the label consultant, because sometimes consultants seems to imply that we only give advice. And When you look at what Accenture does, we're really different than the traditional version of a consultant.
Kommer ikke noe
We're
viktig i dag.
really about relevance and
må gjøre
results,
kjent
and
på at
that's
det
what is driving our business.
What about a
kommer
consultant?
an på hvilken
In
konto,
my
for det er flere
example, I'm
kontoer.
the CEO, I have a problem, I call you up, I say,
På aksjer har jeg tjent
We don't operate as big companies.
veldig mye.
Crisis
På
mode.
kontrakter så tapte
And
jeg
so
jo
we
jævla mye. Jeg tjente først nesten en halv million på
the company being willing to set aggressive goals.
en
And so
måned.
what we are trying to do
Og så
now
tapte jeg
is work with our
720 000 på 3
clients
minutter.
to work differently, to work faster.
Så nå har jeg begynt på nytt igjen. Så nå er jeg opp. Men det er på kontrakter. Hadde alt for høy giring.
From the world of politics to the world of business.
Så nå bygger jeg safe, så jeg tjener penger av det.
Eastern Time. Hosts
Ja, jeg er short. Jeg sa i går at jeg er short.
Alongside Kayleigh Lines, deliver news, insight, and analysis live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters. Get the latest from and about politics' biggest power players at the end of every trading day. Balance of Power, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
From New York City,
From London, in Sydney, from Washington, in Tokyo.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Here's what
Er det pluss der også nå?
Do not want to miss this story.
Is there the kind of upside?
Jeg er short der. Å, fy faen. Se, det der er bra. Jeg shorta der. Men jeg taper når jeg viser dere da. Faen, ass. Jeg bruker mer tid på å flytte pilen enn å ta gevinst. Jeg vet ikke hvordan du skal få løst
From
dette.
Newport Beach, California. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Going into the opening bell equity market shaping up as follows.
ta gevinst.
S&P 500
Ute.
futures just a little bit softer. No drama here.
Sånn tjener man penger.
We're down by not even 0.2%. We're negative 0.11% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, negative about 0.2% as well. There's the opening bell. Switch up the board and get to the bond market. Some interesting moves there. Yields at the front end around 450 on a 10-year, about 370. Yields higher by a single basis point. In the FX market, getting used to life. Below 107 on the euro, 106.80, negative by about 0.3%. All of this going into the Fed's next big meeting. Of the Fed, of course, going silent with its two-day policy meeting kicking off in just 1 week. Here's PIMCO CIO Dan Iverson earlier this hour.
Although we do expect in the base case
I'm short
for
Nasdaq.
inflation to trend back down towards central bank targets, it too is likely to be much more volatile going forward. The balance of risk.
Ta gevinst på den gule der nå. Oi, se! Ta gevinst ute.
Constant disinflationary pressure and a goal and desire from
Nå har jeg
central
dratt
banks to
inn
stimulate
3000 kroner på 1 minutt og 45 sekunder.
Ahead, writing in their secular outlook quote, "We don't expect developed market central banks to formally change their targets, but do expect those targeting 2% to be willing to tolerate 2-point-something inflation as part of what PIMCO is calling an opportunistic disinflation strategy." I'm pleased to say that joining us now is the PIMCO Global Economic Advisor, former Fed Vice Chair, good friend of ours, Richard Clarida. Good morning, Rich.
Great to be here, and thanks for coming out.
Good to see you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Let's start with that. What on earth is opportunistic disinflation strategy? What is that?
Well, in some ways, John, it's back to the future. A lot of folks think of the early Greenspan years in the U.S. as opportunistic disinflation.
Jeg er short Nasdaq, short Dow Jones.
And then basically wait for the next downturn to get it all the way to target. And we actually think it's implicit if you look at the Fed's SEP projections. They don't have inflation getting down to 2% for several more years, and yet they have themselves even cutting rates next year. So we think implicitly, not only the Fed, but other central banks will go down that road.
So when Chairman Powell last year talked about pain, Rich,
Yeah.
do we not need that much pain then? Do we just push out the timeline?
Well, I think there will have to be an adjustment in the labor market even to get to 2-point-something. You see, the challenge now, John, is inflation is running 4-point-something. So I think that pain in the labor market that Chair Powell referred to at Jackson Hole is going to be part of it to get inflation down to 2-point-something. But the next leg may have to wait till the next downturn.
Well, let's talk about the next downturn.
Yeah.
Where on earth is it? We've been talking about this for ages now. When Chairman Powell delivered that speech last year, even when you were at the Fed, I was thinking unemployment here, how's it going to handle this tightening cycle?
Yeah.
We're going from 0 to 5 and unemployment's still around 3.5.
Yeah.
We had Dan sit in your seat a little bit earlier and talk about the longer variable lags. He said potentially they're longer. Is that how you and the team are thinking about it now?
Well, yes. Remember, we actually had a sharp slowdown in growth last year. GDP growth downshifted from 6 to 1. and it will probably be in the ones or even lower this year. So we've had the downshift in growth. Yes, John, the surprise is that the US labor market is very resilient. Typically, that slowdown in growth, you would see much more of a rise in unemployment. Our view continues to be that lags will kick in. Labor market's typically a lagging indicator, but yes, it has been a surprise how resilient the labor market's been.
The Federal Reserve is talking about a skip, not a pause.
How
much effort goes into a shift in language like that? To not use the word pause and for everyone to coalesce around skip?
Well, a lot of effort, a lot of discussion among members of the so-called Troika, the chair, John Williams, and now Phil Jefferson. And then, of course, it's socialized in the broader committee. But suffice to say, there's a lot of wordsmithing that goes on behind the scenes.
The potential future, almost called him the future vice chair, but he is potentially going to be that. Governor Jefferson, talk to me about how pivotal that address from him was last week. How important was that?
It was important. First of all, it was an excellent speech, and really in Phil's voice. I've known Phil for 30 years. We were colleagues at Columbia. But it did something very important, which is that the chair had tried to put his stamp on communication at an event at the Fed two or 3 weeks ago. And then, as is often the case, there's a lot of chatter from different Reserve Bank presidents and governors. And so market pricing was really all over the map. Do they cut? Do they hike? Hike 3 times? Cut 3 times? And so Governor Jefferson came out and gave a very focused speech illustrating that a skip, if the committee chooses to skip, will not indicate that they're done. But they do need to respect the lags and the additional tightening we're likely to get from banking dislocation. So it, in essence, reinforced the message that the chair had delivered weeks before, and I think that served a very useful purpose because it shows that that's what the chair is thinking going into the next meeting.
Do you think this is it, the peak of interest rates of the Fed? Is that the view for you and the team?
Well, is it the peak? I think that the data's been coming in a bit stronger, and if anything, even some of the more dovish members of the committee have sounded a bit hawkish. So we could get an additional hike or two in this cycle. I think it's a closer call than I would have thought several months ago. I will say, I still think that the reasoning that the chair put forward, which is that we've had this dislocation in banking, 2 of the biggest bank failures in U.S. history. Right now markets have sort of moved on to the next thing, but some of those challenges remain. So I think that's going to come back into the discussion at some point as well.
There were some thoughts about rate cuts. We priced them in, we priced them out. Just how high is the bar for rate cuts?
John, I think the bar for rate cuts the rest of this calendar year is very
high.
Not only on economic grounds, but the communication's been very consistent from the most dovish to the most hawkish member. Every member of that committee has said, look, we're not going to do the heavy lifting to get rates in restrictive territory and then start to cut them. So I think the bar to cutting this year is very high because remember, the Fed has penciled into its projections a pretty sharp slowdown in the labor market. They have the unemployment rate going up to 4.5% by the end of the year without any cuts. So I do think if there are cuts, it's really a 2024 story. But yeah, I think the bar's high.
Let's pair this conversation with the secular outlook. What are they going back to if they do begin to cut? There's been a big conversation about that. We're not going back to zero. I think we've both heard that conversation.
Investerer aksjer også, men her med dere så daytrader jeg
Well, we did a lot of discussion and thinking on this.
kun indekser og valuta.
In 2014, we rolled out at our forum the new neutral idea, which was that the Fed funds range would end up neutral somewhere in 2 to 3%. And this year, we reaffirmed that view. So we do think most of the factors that kept policy rates, again, these are the policy rates when you're at full employment and low inflation. We think there's more upside risk to the inflation outlook than the real rate outlook. And so our baseline view is that Jay Powell and Christine Lagarde and Andrew Bailey and the central bankers will do more or less what it takes to keep inflation expectations anchored. But there is a risk to the inflation outlook, it's somewhat to the upside. So we do think that once the inflation rate has come down close to where the Fed wants it, once the economy's adjusted, we think, and apparently they still think through the dots, rates are getting down into the 2s.
You share that view?
I do share that view. I think what could be different this time, this saying this time is different. I think what could be different this time is we may have policy rates in the 2s, but we may have higher bond yields. Treasury issued a lot of debt to support the fiscal policy during the pandemic. We now have a debt to GDP ratio back to where it was in World War II, 100% of GDP. It wasn't that long ago that folks like Ken Rogoff and others were saying once you get above 100, it fundamentally changes your economy. So we do think that the Fed will probably be doing less QE in the future, what we've called QE fatigue. And we think there's a limit to how much Treasury debt investors will hold without getting compensated. So we could see a world of steeper yield curves. Right now they're inverted, but they could re-steepen.
Okay, so basically the Federal Reserve is at 2, and you're thinking about what further out the yield curve?
10-year Treasuries ultimately somewhere in the 3s, depending upon how we get to 2, and also how credible the Fed is on inflation.
They're coming out with a ton of T-bill issuance at the Treasury, hundreds of billions.
Yeah.
Now, if you're a bear, you're bearish about it, and if you're a bull, you don't really care. Give us the reality check. What do you think that ultimately means? Hundreds of billions of dollars of T-bills coming into the
Sitter
market
fortsatt short.
all at once.
Tok en liten gevinst her nå. Sitter fortsatt short Nasdaq. Fortsatt short Dow Jones. Tatt ut noe. Har bare en aksje. Jeg har kontraktfri Dow Jones nå for bare 1,2 mill. Indeksen.
You know, their checking account at the Fed is called the Treasury General account. So they'll do that by issuing T-bills. That will put some upward pressure on finance rates. Not really an issue for the Fed in terms of maintaining its policy rate, but a potential issue for the liquidity of the banking system. Because when the Treasury issues T-bills to private investors, if private investors are not money market funds, those reserves drain the system. It could tighten liquidity in the banking system. If they come from money market funds, which are investing now at the Fed, it may not. So I think there's more than the usual amount of uncertainty about how bank liquidity evolves over the next 6 months with these T-bill sales.
Do you think that's another reason to skip June? To wait?
I do not think that's another reason to skip June. I think that if they skip June, which it looks like they will, it will be basically based on the macro and inflation.
Jeg tror fallet på Dow kan bli noe helt styggjævlig.
Just a final question. In this piece, 2 point something. That's your world. I can hear your language in there. If we set a new inflation target today, not that they're going to, you push back against that, but if we did, would it still be 2%?
Well, the way I like to put it is that if you rewind the tape to 30 years ago and central banks had sort of agreed on 3, I don't think anything would be different now, but there is what people call path dependence in policy, and having committed to doing 2, I think it would be very costly, and I think they'll shy away from formally changing the target.
Interested. Rich, good to see you. Great to catch up as always. Fantastic. Richard Clarida there, the former Fed Vice Chair. Coming up, time to talk markets. We're speaking with PIMCO's Mark Kiesel and Sonali Peer. That conversation just around the corner from a beautiful...
Shorten igjen på Dow. Shorten igjen her.
This is Bloomberg.
Short. Her er penger. Ta gevinst, svart øyeblikk. Ta gevinst, ute.
No one covers the world like Bloomberg.
A lot of the focus and the momentum here is what to do with
Nasdaq'en
this is still a monetary policy story.
The first round results
Bullish, da.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan showing resilience and strength on his nationalist platform.
A number of leaders have come out on both sides of the aisle and say we will not default. That does seem like they are making progress.
Shorte mer Dow Jones her oppe. Den netto tok gevinst på. Short nå. Short allerede.
MasterCard introduced PayPass, its first contactless payment system, in 2002, but the technology took some time to gain traction.
I would say I was invested in this many years ago. The adoption rate on this in the early part
Ta gevinst hvert øyeblikk. Må ha litt lenger ned.
Was fairly slow in the early part. The inflection point of when it really started to hit its stride was when it was used in the transit vertical. So what we figured is
Ta gevinst
get all the
ute.
transit systems around the globe
Nå kommer Nasdaq til å prøve å lage en ny bunn her nå. Vurderer å shorte litt med Nasdaq.
For the consumer who will like the experience in transit and will use it.
Shorte mer Dow. Shorte på nytt, tok nettopp gevinst, venter på at den kommer litt opp. Han kan gå opp til Han kan komme litt mer opp her nå.
We're agnostic as to whether somebody's using the chip technology or the contactless technology or using the mag stripe, which was the old way of doing business. We earn revenues which are quite similar across both of those. The revenue potential and upside for us comes from the fact that now more spend is being done on card-based forms of payment than was being done in the past. So we're converting that cash over to electronic forms of payment.
Short nå. Er penger allerede?
If contactless payments is the current revolution sweeping the payments industry, what's the next one?
I think pay with your smile. So, biometrics.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
There are so many factors at play today.
It remains tight in certain parts of the economy.
Ta gevinst snart øyeblikk på shorten.
Wall Street Week, I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insight.
Crisis is too strong a word, and words like that get used a lot.
From business's most influential and instrumental.
America's economy needs a diversity of institutions. That's something that Wall Street pays a lot of attention.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week, live Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Now I know.
We actually had a sharp slowdown in growth last year. GDP growth downshifted from 6
Short
to
med
1,
Nasdaq.
and it will probably be in the ones or even
Short
lower
med
this
Nasdaq.
year. So we've
Short
had a
nå.
downshift in growth. Yes, John. The surprise is that the U.S. labor market is very.
Ta gevinst på Dowen nå et øyeblikk.
Slowdown in growth. You would see.
Nå er penger på Dowen igjen.
Unemployment. Our
Må ha litt
view
lenger ned.
continues to be that the lags will kick in. Labor market is typically a lagging indicator, but yes, it has been a surprise.
Oi, nå er penger. Ordentlig penger.
That was PIMCO's global economic advisor and former Fed Vice Chair Richard Clarida.
Tok gevinst på Dowen, ferdig der nå. Sitter fortsatt short Nasdaq.
High quality bonds may offer long-term equity-like return potential.
Jeg har fortsatt short Dow, men tok akkurat gevinst på.
Than equities. We believe fixed income markets are pricing in expected volatility in ways that equity markets are not. PIMCO Global Credit CIO Mark Kiesel and multi-sector credit portfolio manager Sonali Peer join us now for more. Guys, great to catch up with you both. Sonali, I wanted to start with you and just talk about the maths of this, just the basic bond maths and why you guys believe that this year is going to be nothing like last year.
Yeah, certainly. The starting higher level of yields this year really provide a cushion. So even if we were to have some spread widening, we do see very high potential for positive returns. We've built in some lower price as well, so there's some downside cushion and some upside convexity in the bond market. Really, the bonds have almost never looked better, given the starting valuations.
Mark, I said this to Dan earlier this morning. It feels like you and the team are throwing cold water at equities this morning. Why is that?
Well, we think you can get equity-like returns in bonds. The long-term equity return over 50 years is 6 to 7%. We think we can get an equity return. We haven't seen this return potential in bonds in 14 years. When you look at nominal and real yields, high-quality bonds can deliver equity returns with half to third the volatility. So this is as exciting as we've seen it in almost 14 years, and we don't think these yields will be here a year from now.
Is there a maturity wall that I need to worry about?
Yeah, we're actually looking at markets where we had such robust open capital markets in the back half of 2020 and in 2021 that companies really termed out their debt. Looking at even high yield markets, we have less than 20% coming due over the next 3 years, which will mean that we have a lower default rate than in previous recessions, albeit higher from here.
Two sectors I think everyone wants to hear from you and the team on: banks, real estate. Can I start with residential? Mark, we've had this conversation before. Pre-crisis, pre-GFC, you called the top. Coming out of it, you called the bottom. Last year, you kind of almost called the top again. What's happening?
Well, I think, Jonathan, what's happening is that the consumer is sitting there with 3.5% unemployment, and also you've underbuilt the housing market for a decade. What happened back in 2006 is we were oversupplied by 2 to 3 million units. And then basically what happened is no one built houses for a decade, and so we undersupplied the market by 3 to 4 million units. So the market's really being held up by very low supply. But on the demand side, these higher interest rates are going to affect people for new purchases. So the bottom line is that housing's been more resilient because of constrained supply.
Is that a story that you're de-risking around in anticipation of trouble ahead? Is that a focus for you?
What we're doing is we're focused on the sectors where we think there's going to be significant secular and cyclical growth. On the secular side, you have things like LNG and defense, where you've got long-term tailwinds. On the cyclical side, you've got this move from goods spending to services. There's still huge pent-up demand for travel.
Du kan kjøre en pair trade der, vet du. Du kan kjøre long Nasdaq og short Dow. Det virker som Nasdaqen stiger når Dowen faller. Det er en hedge. Jævla rart. Dow Jones kan falle mye nå, da.
You know, higher yields and more dispersion gives us a lot more opportunity to invest.
The banking sector hasn't been fun. One thing that I've heard
Lucifer?
repeatedly, and a lot of people have heard repeatedly on programs like this one, is I want to be...
Har du tatt shake fra meg, eller?
Great. And then I can show you a failed
En sånn,
was IG just a month before it failed.
Hvorfor
What's
mangler
gone wrong
det?
in that sector? And what have you learned from what's developed over the last few months?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult for banks to know how long their deposit base is there, right? So in terms of understanding how much we've repriced in terms of interest rates, that steep repricing means that they needed to have managed the duration of it, right? So meaning the assets and the management liability aspect. That's been one issue, and then really deposits are the lifeline for banks. So in terms of, you know, from here, how we evaluate banks is we continue to look at these things, what they're invested in, you know, what their deposit base, how correlated it is.
Det kan dere på Telegram.
Look for opportunities really within that, right? Not all of these banks are in similar situations, and in fact, I would very clearly make this distinction that this is not the great financial crisis. This is more of an issue of, you know, the broader takeaway is the tightening financial conditions, as opposed to the few banks that have been in a very difficult situation.
We know the regionals as a whole have a big role to play in commercial real estate, so let's tie together two themes, real estate and the banks. Mark, it's one of those things that we hear so much about. In fact, it's the number one question that people will come up to me and ask me, what am I telling you about commercial real estate? And then you get these calm, cool heads that come on programs like this and say, there's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to see. Is there anything to worry about? Is there anything to see?
Well, I think, John, just like all markets, there's going to be winners and losers, and credit is tightening most for the commercial real estate sector. You're seeing that in the regional bank, equity performance, the commercial REITs, et cetera. So this is actually going to end up in opportunities down the road for our private credit business. So we're actually very excited about it.
Tager vinst på Nasdaqen med North River. Ute av Nasdaq. Fortsatt short den gamle kontrakten fra stad. Shorta der oppe, tok gevinst der, og short her, selger her nede.
Don't you think the repricing that's yet to come in private markets is going to have some kind of negative spillover for what develops in public markets? The losses that people might have to absorb there?
Yeah, it will, and that's why when you look at where we have been focused, we've been focused on these sectors where you've got significant improvement.
Shorter på nytt, Dow Jones. Nå.
I can show you many sectors where even if we have a mild recession in the United States, credit fundamentals will improve.
Helvete, han falt for fort. Jeg fikk ikke shorta.
Name one. LNG. LNG is on long-term contracts, and that sector will look more healthy a year from now than it does today, even if we have a recession.
We'll be sitting here in a year from now and we can talk about it. Mark Kiesel, Sonali Peer, to the two of you, thank you. Thank you very much. Coming up, the conversation will continue. We're going to round out this hour with the man himself.
Ta gevinst på Nasdaq short på nytt.
Manny Roman, another
Tok gevinst nå,
exclusive
ute. Shorter Wall Street på nytt nå. Vent litt, jeg må ha litt høyere opp. Shorta nå, midt på. Likte ikke helt inngangen, men shorta.
Gått i gassen allerede.
Ja, jeg har dratt inn masse penger her nå. Ta gevinst på Dowen mens han nettopp shorta. Gjør det flere ganger. Må ha han litt lenger ned. Å, fy faen, den traff jeg. Oi! Ser du shorten, eller? Men jeg bruker for mye tid av å vise med pila, så jeg går glipp av å ta gevinst. Faen, ass.
We were constantly hustling behind him as he caught up with executives in the portfolio companies and reminisced with former and current players.
Er ikke det typisk?
Jo, du må jo bare ta det, men du vet hvis du bare trykker der, så kan du ha på linjen hele tiden.
Nei, det går ikke, for jeg må trykke hver gang jeg gjør en transaksjon.
Åja, ok. Ja, for du trader jo på den andre. Ja.
Nå tar jeg gevinst ute. Den var jævla pen, da.
And so it's kind of all come together. My firm, our charity, our fundraising efforts, and then the friends that are around. My dad and my brother, it all happens right there as a confluence of all these parts of my life that have found its...
Shorte Nasdaq på nytt nå. Den er ikke så god, altså, den Nasdaqen. Den har en jævla... Den prøver seg på oppsiden hele tiden.
Jeg har ikke åpnet Nasdaqen i trading på tele engang.
Jeg har ikke shortet den ennå. Jeg sitter fortsatt short Dow Jones. Så det er én kontrakt bare i Nasdaq. Men når Dow kommer ned, så kommer Nasdaq opp, så det er veldig sånn rart.
These types of risks that were well contained for an extended period of time and led to a certain type of risk seeking and investors is likely behind us.
Apple, det er Apple i begge, det skjønner jeg ikke.
Synchronized world, and a world that's going to create, you know, a tremendous amount of opportunity to take advantage of shifting opportunities.
Shorter Dow Jones på nytt her nå, hvert øyeblikk. Nå shorter jeg Dow Jones.
PIMCO publishing its secular outlook, the aftershock economy, writing, quote, we see a window to step in as a senior lender in areas once occupied by regional banks.
Shorter også Nasdaq på nytt. Jeg skal ha den opp mot Emma her nå.
Finance. I'm very pleased to say that we can have that conversation now with the man himself, the boss, PIMCO CEO, Manny Roman. Manny, good morning to you. Thanks for having us.
Good morning, Jonathan. Nice to see you.
Ta gevinst på Dow Jones short men nå.
We're going to step in. My first thought when I read that was, why don't you just buy a bank? There's many banks on sale right now. Why don't you just buy a bank?
Well, I think there are going to be many assets to buy. And maybe the best way I have to describe it is banks are going to be tight for capital.
Jeg har ikke tatt den ennå.
And when they're tight for capital, they have two ways of solving the problem. They can either raise more capital or they can sell assets.
Det er snart ett år
the most likely scenario is there will be assets to
Short
sell
Nasdaq på nytt nå.
where we have a big footprint. Mortgages, commercial real estate, bonds, municipal bonds. Dan said that earlier today that he was very keen on mortgages. There'll be mortgages to sell, and we'll be there to step in and try to buy them.
Ta gevinst på Nasdaq, men nå... Den henger seg, faen.
Ta
gevinst på Dow Jones min nå. På det low nesten nå. La jeg lagre en ny bunn nå, tror jeg. Sitter fortsatt, dekker meg ikke ennå. Tror du kan falle veldig her nå. Wow! Tok gevinst, ute. Sitter fortsatt lagt av. For en million på Dow. Ny low er nå på Dow.
How competitive is this going to be? Can you give me some size and scope and how big the pie is going to be?
It is going to be competitive.
Er det TV-en som kukker med oss, siden jeg får ikke lukka?
Ja, jeg kommer meg ikke inn.
Så kommer Dow videre ned. Nå har jeg hentet inn 5.000. Har jeg hentet inn på 27 minutter. Så jeg hentet en 10%. Nei, det er mer.
To look at the opportunity, and some will look better than the other. It may very well be that the single best asset turns out to be real estate where we have a big footprint, or it may very well be that it turns out to be commercial real estate.
Hvorfor jeg venter? Jeg tror jeg skal videre ned, for det er marketmakere som kjører posisjonen med en stopplås, så jeg tar scalper hele tiden. Jeg er 200 ganger giring. Hadde jeg vært vanlig gira, så hadde det ikke vært noe problem. Se Nasdaq, oppe og tester.
Well, I think we have, and I think we've seen the playbook before, and it is everything else being equal a slow cycle, so the banks will look at their portfolio and slowly but surely mark their books. I think you have a microstructure of the commercial real estate market, which is quite...
Kjører en liten lett short på Nasdaq. Nå, der.
Some places are clearly tested. Some of them are doing just fine. I mean, you can look at Austin, for example. You're hard pressed.
Den her kommer jo opp når den går ned, så folk hedger seg. Men det er bare tull.
The trend is going to be that people somehow come back to work one way or the other. But there's a transition period where for sure there will be
Ta gevinst på Nasdaqen min, den grønne der, jeg shorta der nå.
I think the financing part is really, really important because it's one of the segments where we're very involved and people have borrowed short
Ta gevinst nå. Ute.
In the past with very low rates, all of a sudden
Jeg er fortsatt short Nasdaq. Nei, Dow Jones, og så er én kontrakt igjen på Nasdaq.
And so they will need to address the
Hvor har
situation
kontrakten din på Nasdaq? Hvor har kontrakten din på Nasdaq?
Den er kjøpt helt på topp på fredag.
A multi-decade bull market. Most people assume that's now over based on the last 12 months. Can you tell me how this business will be different with that in mind? What you need to position for now versus what this firm was positioned for in the previous several decades?
Well, the very big change, and Dan mentioned this before, is...
Men Dow Jones skal falle mye da, gass. Den kan falle helt jævlig, liksom.
And think, for example, about the real estate market.
We can
hire 100 people to go from city to city and kind of look at every single lease or...
Hadde jeg hatt en million nå, så hadde jeg shortet Dow her nå.
We can use technology to give us a better grasp of where the the opportunity is. When we think about communication with client, we can invest significantly in generative AI and actually give a better risk report, better customized report to clients, and so on and so forth. And I think it's incredibly exciting. I see the work that we do with AI and Microsoft as important as the birth of the internet. I mean, it is that.
You think it's that powerful?
It is that powerful, and it will change your job also.
Jeg skulle til å si foreløpig bygger han jo en oppovertrend som ikke bryr.
I think it will make us more.
Det er short fra den streken her
I
nå.
think that's a really, really good thing.
Is that a challenge to your second round?
I think on a super secular, on a super...
Pepsi's Number Fever campaign in the Philippines has probably gone down in history as one of the biggest marketing disasters in history, mainly because of a human error that led Pepsi to print more winning caps than they planned. The resulting chaos caused riots, civil unrest, and even deaths. Reporting this story took over a year, and it resulted in me flying to Manila in the Philippines to meet unlucky winners.
Short en Nasdaq på nytt. Nå begynner de også å kuke hverandre. Short Nasdaq på nytt. Ta gevinst på...
My name is Jeff Maish. I'm a journalist based in Los Angeles. I wrote the story for Bloomberg Business Week about Pepsi's Number Fever campaign.
Ta gevinst her nå.
The Philippines is a really interesting country.
Jeg liker ikke den trenden helt, for den er liksom midt på.
And it's also a country that's very heavily influenced by American culture is everywhere you look in the Philippines. They're obsessed with Frank Sinatra music, for example. They love all things American.
Jeg tror jeg kan få en bedre inngang.
Extends to their
Men jeg er fortsatt short.
Pepsi Cola.
På Nasdaqen tenkte du, eller på Dava?
På Dowen. Nasdaq shortet jeg nettopp, er i penger.
Pepsi and Coca-Cola were embroiled in what is now known as the Cola Wars. It was a fierce battle for market dominance. Number Fever was already a really popular promotion. It had been rolled out in America to great success. And so Pepsi decided to roll it out internationally, particularly in Asia. They thought it was the answer to their problems. They thought it could finally help them beat their biggest competitor.
Shorter Dow Jones på nytt nå. Nå.
$1 million pesos or $68,000 doesn't sound like a lot now, but in 1992, that was a phenomenal amount of money. You've got to remember that in the Philippines at the time, the average monthly income was about $100, so $1 million pesos was wealth beyond anyone's wildest imaginations. Number Fever caught fire in the Philippines. Kids were saving up their pocket money to buy a bottle of Pepsi. Parents were
Det så
squirreling
drit å ha
away
med praten
with
jævla
bottle caps in
Pepsi-driten
bags.
sin I
You
Filippinene.
would walk down the street and people
Ja, han prater om det hele tida.
I get 30, 40 emails I couldn't repeat on air in terms of some of the haters. So it speaks to, it's a divisive time right now between the bulls and a lot of those bears that are now deep in the caves in hibernation mode.
So what is the benchmark timeline for some of the major investments, especially given the thrust of either FOMO or people who just want to look at the AI space and get a snippet of it and get involved? What's the benchmark that they should be looking at? We're trying to get a sense of that from everyone who covers this space.
Sure, I mean, the New York City cap drivers, Microsoft and Nvidia are obviously top of the mountain. But you look at second, third, fourth derivatives, I think it's just starting today. In other words, now look, going back to some of the I think worries out there, are there going to be fakes? Are there going to be ones where there's hype but not real, no meat on the bones? Yeah. But I think overall, this is going to be a transformational trend across software, cybersecurity, big data. Look at MongoDB. You look at names like Palantir. You look at names like now all of a sudden that are on the radar because they built moats, and now you're starting to see the use cases. And it just comes down to anyone that wants NVIDIA, and that's going to be known as guidance heard around the world.
Ikke noe spesielle tall som kommer I dag heller, så det her jo så organisk marked for deg, så du får det.
Jeg elsker sånn som det nå. Hvor det går alle veier, mest rett.
Well, speaking of skepticism,
Ja, han har ligger jo
let's go back to
egentlig
Tesla for a
pluss
minute,
minus
because I get the other side of it. If I say
0,3%,
anything
liksom,
critical
de
of
tredje
Tesla,
bare I en
I
kanal
hear
her
from
nå.
the people who you don't hear from when you write the good notes.
Sure.
So there's a lot of obviously strong feelings about it on both sides. But the stock has been steadily creeping up here this year. It still has not reattained its highs, but it's seen some recent enthusiasm. And the question I always ask with Tesla is whether it's going to be able to deliver. Clearly it has in the past, but as time goes on, it then has more and more to deliver on.
Totally. Look, I think essentially...
Nasdaq går ned, da går Dow opp. Det ta gevinsten på Nasdaqen.
Talked about finally starting to advertise, talked about maybe the view from a battery technology perspective, margins, and I think ultimately planted a flag. In other words, like that's the one where it's like, okay, here's what we need to do for the year. And this ultimately is what we need to execute. In my opinion, Tesla's a name where, just like maybe on Apple or Google over years, if you look at over a 1 to 2 quarter period, you miss transformation what's happened. I think the price cuts were the smart move. They essentially put an iron fence around their install base. Now, this next quarter coming up, we'll get obviously orders, first week in July in terms of units. You need to deliver in China. And I think that ultimately, the biggest, debate right now from the bears, it's China. Can, in a price war, they ultimately navigate that? That's what Musk and Tesla need to navigate. We believe they can.
Dan, stick with us for a hot second here. We've got some breaking news that's been coming out.
If you've noticed us looking down at our computers a lot.
Monitoring some headlines a lot. Based on a CNBC report as of right now, the PGA Tour has agreed to merge with the Saudi-funded Live Golf Tour, LIV. And we talk.
I love watching Dan's reaction in real time. Not that you cover these; these are not stocks, obviously.
But you and I we've been waiting for our Masters invitations for years at this point,
and they still haven't come.
Mine's in the mail. That's what they've been saying. I mean, your immediate reaction after you see a sport that we both follow having a major tie-up after years for the PGA taking so much criticism because of how quickly LIV has been able to take over some of the golfers, get fanfare for a tour that's got now some fans that are just looking for an experience that's more like a concert instead of like the country club.
Yeah, I think, but this is also a shock, right?
Ikke Binance som blir saksøkt da?
Jo, Binance med de der søsterselskapene amerikanerne for å drive manipulering eller hedging mot kundene sine.
How this plays out, but I'd call this just as a huge golf fan.
Nå har den snudd
What are the golfers going to do? how are they going to react to this? The ones who have been resistant
right.
to live.
And do you have multiple formats that live in tandem? No pun intended.
And then you have Mickelson, who's probably sitting there with a glass of champagne, because ultimately this really was a big part of his sort of view.
Yeah, right now I imagine he's shaking up that champagne and just letting it rock everywhere right now. But yeah, that's the big news that's kind of been rattling through some of the social media landscape. We'll see if we get any details around that. Dan, very wide-ranging conversation that it's turned out to be.
Great to be here.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Dan,
Men Nasdaq push også, sammen med Dow Jones alt push.
And guys, coming up, why our next guest says the Fed could skip a hike in June, but don't count out July. We'll speak with the Bank of America's Michael Gapin. That's next.
Shorten Nasdaq på nytt nå. Vurderer også å gå long Dow. Fordi de går mot hverandre. Av en eller annen merkelig grunn. Hva er det som skjer her? Nå er det nyheter som har kommet som vi ikke har fått med oss.
Jeg har ikke fått noe annet enn Financial Strength, XLF, BKX, hva man i faen det betyr.
Hvordan går det da? Det går veldig bra.
Det er enda en time til 4-week bill announcement kommer, og det så ikke ut som noen spesielle nyheter heller, så det er ikke noe rent teknisk, tror jeg, etterspørsel som blir fylt. Det er ikke så mange poeng der pushen ser her nå. Det er bare 0,2%.
Jeg shorta, ja, men jeg stikker jo zooma til helvete.
Ja. Jeg vurderer å gå short på Nasdaq her, hvert øyeblikk. Der skal han opp til before open.
Hva står det?
Så ut som han kanskje skal helt opp til open. Setter jo noe på liksom kanalen og trailer før det åpner.
Jeg vurderer opp med longer nå, altså. Men det er ikke noen nyheter, sier du?
Ingenting. Google har pushet opp, Meta har pushet opp kraftig. Det er ikke noe Tesla ned. AMD har pushet jævlig opp i dag. Nvidia ned.
Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Live. I'm Julie Hyman alongside Brad Smith. And as we take a look at markets today, we are not seeing a lot of movement here, right? We've got all three major averages that are very little changed in today's session. So I've been watching on the Yahoo Finance Interactive what is moving. Oil futures are certainly moving here today. We had that bump up yesterday as Saudi Arabia announced a surprise production cut for the next month, but now we've got prices coming back down. There's still some talk about demand here and whether that's going to be robust enough. And the Saudi Arabia cut is indeed just short term. So if you look at how that is then feeding through to the equity markets today, as Brad pointed out earlier, we've got energy stocks in the red, not by much, just down about, call it not even 0.2% here. Consumer staples.
All three indexes, day highs, no headline
materials up the most in today's session. We continue to watch the big NASDAQ movers in today's session, but there too we do not have an enormous amount of movement. Interesting, a day after we see the Apple unveiling its Vision Pro, to see its shares down and Meta shares up a little bit, 1.2%. Meta, of course, offering the much cheaper.
Sikkert bare litt market makere som begynte å kuke litt, og så har du noe oppe å teste støttene.
At first blush, so that's something that we'll continue to watch. And then just quickly,
Det koster bare
want to
noen
check
milliarder først
crypto
opp så
stocks
mye
as
sånn.
well. Coinbase continuing its
Milliarder
downward
dollar.
trajectory after being sued by the SEC, off by 15%.
Well, the S&P 500 is approaching bull market territory, but that doesn't mean everyone is betting on the index to rise higher. Our markets reporter, Josh Schaefer, is here with an outlook on the S&P 500. So, Josh, what do you got for us?
Yeah, Brad, so what I brought with me here today, we got a fancy chart over here, right? Let's take a look at this chart from Bespoke Investment. And what you're looking at is speculative bets on what the S&P 500 will do in the future, right?
Shorter du der oppe, eller?
Futures. And investors are largely short on the S&P 500 at their highest level since 2007. So you can see that here. That's been that downward trend we're seeing there.
På Nasdaq.
Of course, people worried about essentially the narrow breadth we've seen in the S&P 500. A lot of tech stocks have driven that up. Basically, 7 stocks are what people have been following, such as Nvidia, driving that run up that we've seen in the S&P 500.
Kan komme helt ned dit. Jeg sitter klar til å ta gevinst. Egentlig kunne man tatt en litt bedre inngang.
Fed that lagging policy, those impacts could eventually hurt earnings in the second half of the year. They see earnings declining 16% to end the year. We should note that it's largely in the minority of what we've been seeing. We've seen actually several upgrades to S&P 500 targets, which Julie, I know you wrote about this morning in our morning brief. And that's what's interesting when you take a look at another chart from Bespoke. So I want to show you a second chart here that shows what happens when we do enter a bull market. And what's interesting here is you can
When we do enter a bull market, fuck off, det har vært bull market det faen meg siden oktober I fjor, en klønekuk.
You see the S&P 500 take off pretty significantly. So this is
Hvis du var happy I bull market, markedet har faen meg gått opp til helvete på ræva nyheter, det bull market. Det har vært et bull market. Selv igjennom resesjon.
Through about the first 30 days there, and then historically, on average, it does take off. One other thing that I found interesting from this Bespoke note, guys, was this is the longest it has taken for us to enter a bull market since about the 1950s, the late 1950s. It's been 162 days. We've been sort of on this slow track up, and that's historically pretty slow compared to what we've seen.
Yes, this is old in bear market terms, I guess. Yeah. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. Well, as investors continue to digest May's jobs number and move on to the much anticipated Fed decision next week, our next guest says while the Fed could skip a hike in June, another rate hike cannot be ruled out. Michael Gapin is Bank of America chief.
Ta gevinst på Nasdaq min snart. Den shortet der oppe. Ja, fin da.
You take the jobs report or what have you.
Jeg tror hun bryter gjennom Emma her nå.
I guess what's surprising is the tenor and the discussion around the economic data seems to have improved, but as we were just pointing out, the market is not quite there on re-entering a bull market. Do you think we have a perception gap right now between the actual data and how it's been perceived?
No, I don't think so. I think you're exactly right in terms of the tenor of the discussion around the macro data has improved. That's in part because risks have been reduced. We've gotten past the debt limit. It looks like the bank stress situation is in stasis. It's not getting a lot better, but it's not getting materially worse. And underneath that, the employment and other spending data show an economy that's generally resilient. But I think if you're discussing and debating whether equities are on the edge of a bull market, I think that generally means equity prices are reflecting that broader macro backdrop. I don't think there's much of a disconnect in my opinion.
We've been following all of the moves of the CME FedWatch tool in whether or not there will be a rate hike or not at the next meeting. Is the data suggesting, from your perspective, that there needs to be one solid decision or another from the Fed?
I think that the decision, I mean, it's tough for them right now because they have said, hey, we've done a lot fast by historical perspectives. And what we'd like to do is take the opportunity to look around a bit and assess those lags and assess bank stress and see where the economy's going and make a decision if we need to do more. It's pretty clear they're starting to lean in that direction. As I mentioned, risks receding a bit, bank stress stabilizing, the macro data generally looking good. They've been communicating that, hey, maybe we do have a little more work in front of us. So the trick will be how do you balance that message next week? Have you seen enough to tell markets you're ready to do more, but just not in June? It's a tricky message to deliver.
Yeah, and as we know, sometimes it's tough with that kind of nuance for the Fed, for anyone, but for the Federal Reserve, where there is so much attention on them. The backdrop for this, of course, is economic growth, whether we're going to enter a recession this year. Where are you on that calculus right now, Michael?
I mean, we're still in the mild recession camp later this year, but about as strong as we've ever been on that is to say we think it's just more likely than not. We've never really firmly pounded the table on that other than to say, look, we think some correction of imbalances in the labor markets ultimately will be needed to bring inflation down to 2%. And normally that does look like an NBER-defined recession at some point. But we've been, at the same time, we have to acknowledge where the data flow is, and that's always been in the direction of resilience. You can't rule out a soft landing, but yes, we think more likely than not, we will have that correction in the labor market later this year.
And so the labor market usually kind of the last to realize that we're in a recession. So does that mean that we'll be in a mild, from your perspective, or a more severe type of recession experienced?
I think mild, and I define mild as something less severe than the average recession. So for example, a peak to trough decline in GDP in the, closer to 1.5% would be where the average downturn has been. I think our peak to trough decline rounds up to 1%. So we're maybe half as severe as the average recession. And this is in part why using the R word sometimes is a little misleading. There's not a major difference from a macro and markets perspective from a mild recession and a soft landing, and I think that's what financial markets are telling you. So unless bank stress gets worse and a credit crunch is revealed, it's harder to see where that is coming from at present.
There was an interesting note out this morning, Michael, from your peers over at Goldman Sachs, who said because we avoided the debt ceiling situation, they sort of ratcheted down their chances of recession this year. I think they're putting it at 25%. I would like to never discuss the thing again, but I am curious if that changed your model.
Nå kjøpes det på oppsiden. Se på bevegelsen også. Candlesticksene ser ferdig ut, den henger sånn.
1 to 3 days after the actual X date was reached. So we did feel it would run right up to the very end, but we always had an agreement in our baseline, and I think what we just discussed really as part of the debt limit agreement were the budget caps we would have had to discuss under the budget at the end of September, at the end of the fiscal year. So we just brought that discussion forward, and again, in divided government, about what you're going to get is what we got. So this really for us was really no change in terms of our view on fiscal policy. We felt it would be neutral in terms of contributions to the outlook going forward, and maybe taking a breather on fiscal spending after 3 years of a lot of spending is the right idea.
We've continued to hear another R word, especially from some of your peers at other banks over the course of the earnings season, resilient, and saying that the consumer is healthy and resilient. What type of resiliency are we seeing in the consumer right now in comparison to periods prior to other recessions in the past?
Right, yes, this is, as you know, and has been discussed often over the last few years, this is a very different business cycle, a very different recovery, and there's still a lot of support for the consumer from strong labor markets, from deferred and excess saving, as well as wealth effects. And I don't think household balance sheets probably get enough discussion in this conversation. From trough to peak during COVID, household balance sheets added over $33 trillion in net worth. So more than 1 year's worth of GDP in financial prices as well as home prices. All three of those are still supporting spending. They're supporting spending less than they were in the past, and credit conditions have certainly tightened, and the cost of credit has risen, so that's a headwind. But I still think there's tailwinds there that are showing through and keeping the economy in an expansion phase and leaning the Fed in the direction of thinking it still needs to do more.
Yeah, we're going to continue to watch those loan officer surveys very carefully, Michael. Michael Gapin is Bank of America chief economist. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, a crisis in cable. CNN CEO may have lost the support of staff and leadership alike. What's the bigger picture outlook for the network and its parent company?
Bort med en Nasdaq her. Jeg kan ikke helt skjønne hvorfor i helvete skal komme opp. Jeg venter. Vi ser at Nasdaq går opp når Dow går ned.
Men de korrelerer jo ikke sånn helt da, men ja.
Hadde du shortet Dow hvis du hadde gått long Nasdaq, så hadde du tjent penger. Hadde du kjøpt Nasdaq i dag og shortet Dow, så hadde du gjort omvendt. Ja, shortet nå.
Det er ikke ut som Ricky har tatt den posisjonen i dag.
Han sitter sikkert bare og følger med. Jeg vurderer å longe og dekke meg når jeg går long Nasdaq. Nå ser han har motstand her. Jeg føler bare å gå ut til null.
Altså, consumer crediten i morgen er jo litt interessant. Noe annet enn det så skjer det jo ikke noe spicy news før torsdag.
Så nå kommer Nasdaq ned, og nå går candlestickene på Dow opp. Spesielt.
CNN executive Chris Licht reportedly apologized to staffers after an unflattering profile in The Atlantic called his authority into question. Licht saying he'll, quote, fight like hell to win back his staff's trust, but some say the damage is already done. A lot of reporting both outside and inside the organization. Frustrations came to a head when a recent Trump town hall, which Licht was quoted, he wanted the audience to be extra Trumpy, drew condemnation from staff. Licht took the helm as CEO
Dow ned, og nå går Nasdaq opp.
And in his short tenure, the network has weathered declining ratings, layoffs, programming shakeups, and several high-profile departures. Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav recently appointed David Levy, a close associate, to a leadership position at the network.
Nå kommer det ned, men nå tror jeg kommer ordentlig ned, for det kommer begge ned. Det har ikke skjedd siden klatreturen.
CNN trails in the ratings behind partisan cable favorites MSNBC and Fox News, which still boast strong viewership despite the sudden departure of audience favorite Tucker Carlson. With more on what this shakeup means for CNN and its parent company, Warner Brothers Discovery, is Eric Deggans. He's NPR TV critic and media analyst, alongside Dave Hager, Edward Jones, senior equity analyst. Thanks to you both very much for being here. Eric, I want to start with you and kind
Hva gjør
of
Apple i dag, da?
sort of behind the scenes drama
Apple
that we in the media
ned
industry
0,4%,
always find
nesten
covering
ingenting.
and talking about, and it's interesting for us because we're in it. What about what's happening on
Jeg har ennå ikke skjønt hvorfor den er på både Dowen og
beyond that
Nasdaqen
Trump
da.
town hall?
Yeah, I think the
Yeah,
biggest
amazing.
evidence, of course, was when Chris Licht first took over. Several people were let go, including Brian Stelter, who was a vocal critic of the conservative-oriented Fox News channel and had written a book taking them on. They canceled the media analysis show Reliable Sources and let him go. They let go John Harwood, another correspondent who was considered a vocal critic of conservatives. So they, you know, right away they sort of set the idea that they were going to try and reset CNN's image as a more centrist network. And then as time went on, of course, they had to figure out what to do with 9 p.m. Chris Cuomo, the person who'd been the star there, was forced out before Chris Licht took over, and they still really haven't figured out exactly what to do with that 9 p.m. Caitlin Collins is going to take it over now. You know, Chris was known as a wonderkind in the morning. He had redesigned CBS's morning show. He was one of the minds behind Morning Joe on MSNBC. So the thought was that he would redesign CNN's morning show, and that, of course, didn't go well because Don Lemon, the anchor there, said controversial things, wound up being let go. And the show just has never caught fire with viewers. So in addition to all this behind the scenes, he's having a real hard time doing what his reputation was, creating compelling programming that viewers might want to see. And he's faced two problems, which is that, you know, viewership for regular cable television is dropping every year anyway. And I think viewership reacted really negatively to some of the things that he's done in terms of trying to change the channel's image, because they viewed it as limiting criticism of conservatives rather than moving CNN to the political center.
And Dave, is this turmoil anything that would show
What's up now?
up within
Hva
the
handler om
stock
for noe?
reaction? Has it shown up
Han
within the
long
valuation
Nasdaq
of Warner Brothers Discovery,
fra
the parent company?
Well, I'd say in the short term, I don't think it's having a significant impact on the share price.
14,499.
The broader question with Warner
Han er
Brothers
minus, da.
Discovery, the parent company,
Nei, han er pluss.
is getting through
14,4.
the post
14,499.
merger.
Han er oppsida på 0,4%.
Warner
Han
Media
trader triple leverage. Han er oppe
getting the cost structure of the business
1,32%.
to where it can be a
Ja, han er lang
business as
fra
a whole, and so
helt nede på rett etter
the
bunn.
challenges on that front,
I dag.
just doing that integration,
Nasdaq, hvis du
and
blar litt ned der.
Der nede.
unfortunately,
Bunn er altså
the
rett oppe
cost
på den
cutting has
wicken der.
impacted CNN and a number of the other operations within
Så
the company. But
fra
I think
klokka
ultimately
Hva blir det fra?
in the shorter term,
15.39. Det er 15.39 han lå på
how
close
the
der.
company does towards hitting its financial targets. But you know, certainly if challenges at CNN continue, that will definitely have a ratings impact and ultimately a financial impact within CNN.
Dave, how much of a
Ta
revenue
gevinst på Nasdaq, men nå
contributor is
snart.
CNN to the overall operation? I mean, I know, you know, obviously it's a big
Yeah.
company, but how important is CNN? And then beyond sort of the just dollars and cents of it, how important is it as a reflection, say, of David Zaslav's management?
Well, the company doesn't break out detailed financials for CNN.
Se,
but,
Dow
I think
opp,
suffice it to say
Nasdaq ned.
within,
Ser du nå, eller?
You know, traditional cable TV,
Ja.
news
Ta gevinst på
shows
Nasdaq,
and news
ute.
channels have still been
Den var fin, den der, da.
decent ratings draws. You know, certainly you look, for instance, at Fox, it's
Har en to små kontrakter
does
her.
fairly well in terms of primetime ratings
Helt ved bryten her.
for a cable TV channel. So, you know, certainly getting CNN back on track and improving viewership, I think could be a positive financially for the company. And I think the strategy of trying to take it back to being more of a neutral news source is an admirable goal. It just seems like so far the execution has not hit on the mark of where it needs to be.
And
Eric, I could weigh in on that a little bit and say that as someone who's covered CNN for a long time, I think one of the quandaries that the company has faced is that its American TV operation is a smaller part of its larger, the larger sprawl of the company than people realize, but it is a major definer of the brand. And I think one of the biggest challenges that Warner Brothers Discovery faces is that the American TV operation defines CNN's brand across the world. And, you know, it has this news operation that reaches across the world, can be seen in TV sets across the globe, but it is often defined by what the American news channel does. And so it's not necessarily just about the ratings that they get on American TV sets. It's about how that brand is regarded as a journalism arbiter, and also how that brand is regarded when you get outside of the polarized political environment that we have here in the United States. What do news audiences in India and China and Britain think about CNN outside of the haze of the political partisanship that we have here in America? And I think, again, they might look at some of the changes that were made to CNN and say they don't make a lot of sense because they don't seem to reflect a larger plan for successfully creating compelling content out of a new direction for CNN. And I think that's Licht's other issue, is that he came to a staff, he criticized the work they had done in the past, but he didn't offer a comprehensive plan for how they were going to do things differently. And as the criticism began to mount over what he was doing, he had a tighter and tighter circle of people close to him that he would talk about his plans with. So a lot of people in the company felt they had no idea what he was planning. They weren't really sure how he was going to reflect his values in actual programming, and they felt like the things they were not succeeding. And so that's a big problem when you're trying to rally the troops for a new direction.
And so, Eric, just to kind of follow on that, it sounds like the troops know, because of Chris Licht's acknowledgement, that he has been a distraction, which he apologized for, but it seems like he was even kind of glossing over why he was the distraction. So if there is a leadership change at CNN, number one, do you expect there to be a leadership change at CNN? And number two, how does that drastically change the culture internally?
Well, it depends. It all depends on why that leadership change happens. I mean, the other thing that comes out through the Atlantic article that has become such a crisis point for Licht is that he was doing what the people who own and control Warner Brothers Discovery wanted him to do. So if you bring in a new person and they do exactly the same thing that Licht did, I'm not sure you're going to get much different results. Also, who in the world of TV news wants that job now? Good luck finding someone who is qualified to take that job. There were even questions about whether Licht was qualified because he had never really run a company as big as CNN before he got the job. Good luck finding someone who's qualified to take the job, who's willing to take it on now, given the level of criticism, the level of attention, and the level of animosity amongst the staff and their skepticism about the leadership at Warner Brothers Discovery. It is going to take someone with superhuman powers of management to come in there and unwind some of the problems that have happened. So I think it's largely up to Licht to try to figure out how to undo this. And with a new COO by his side, he can focus on programming, which is supposed to be what he's good at. And hopefully he will come up with some things some wins in terms of new programming that will sort of restore his confidence amongst the staff at CNN.
Well, there's maybe somebody who could do that job. It's the guy who had it before, and it sounds like maybe he kind of wants it back. I'm talking about Jeff Zucker. And in another story that of the many that has been following this whole situation, the idea was floated that maybe he's talked one time or another about trying to buy the network from Warner Brothers Discovery, although it doesn't seem to be in current talks or anything like that. But Dave, just quickly for you, would that be good for Warner Brothers Discovery? Would shareholders actually want it to offload the network entirely?
Well, it could be depending on the financial situation of the network, as it's struggled with ratings recently. That could potentially be well received. It would help remove another cost source of costs in the business, and certainly CEO David Zaslav has been focused on improving the cost structure and positioning the company for the transition to streaming, and because certainly that's the direction the industry is going. And they really have not set a streaming strategy for CNN. They cut off CNN Plus, which was a streaming strategy under the prior management, because the cost was too high. And so it might make sense, if there was an interested buyer on the right terms, that might be received well by investors, if it could improve the overall financial results of the company.
Interesting. Eric Deggans, who is NPR TV critic, media analyst, and Dave Hager, who is the Edward Jones Senior Equity Analyst. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for taking the time here with and discussing this story that continues to evolve here in front of our eyes. Appreciate it. Coming up, a new report from the World Bank projects global growth slowing this year, but how long do we go? An important interview on the other side. You don't want to miss it. A new report from the World Bank is projecting that the global growth will slow this year, matching the lows of the 2008 financial crisis. We're going live to Washington, D.C., where Yahoo Finance's Jennifer Schonberger has more to share on this. Jennifer?
Good morning, Brad. And for more on the World Bank's latest global economic outlook, I want to bring into the program Ayan Kosa, Deputy Chief Economist of the World Bank, who co-authored this report. Ayan, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
You're now projecting that global growth will expand just 2.1% this year. That's down from just over 3% last year, and the same level seen during the 2008 financial crisis. Is the global economy essentially poised for recession territory here?
Jennifer, we don't see a recession this year and next year in the global economy. But as you mentioned, growth remains weak, and there is this unfortunate parallel with the 2008 growth number. The big story is the following. Global growth rebounded significantly in 2021, slowed down in 2022, and that slowdown continues this year. In fact, from 2022 to 2023, 70% of countries will see weaker growth. and
Short on Nasdaq på nytt nå.
troubling to say the least.
You say in the report there's the possibility for more widespread tremors from the banking turmoil that was seen earlier this year, and thus credit tightening, which could push global growth even lower than the 2% level projected right now. Does the World Bank not believe that the banking issues are contained?
Gevinst på Nasdaq nå. Ute.
I think the initial banking stress
Må logge av og på, for det henger seg.
Contained in the way policymakers acted aggressively and comprehensively. But when you look at credit surveys, when you look at latest credit numbers, you definitely see that credit has been tightening and financial conditions are getting more and more difficult. And from the perspective of emerging market developing economies, especially those with larger vulnerabilities in terms of their deficits and debt levels, this is not good news. Yes, in a nutshell, if banking stress gets intensified, we might end up seeing even weaker growth next year.
You mentioned emerging markets, certainly higher interest rates in many of the advanced economies, stresses in the global banking system that we just talked about are spilling over, have the potential to spill over into emerging markets, and particularly be troublesome for those countries that are having to service larger debt loads denominated in US dollars. What is the prospect for an emerging market crisis, something on perhaps the level seen during the Asian financial crisis in 1997?
We do not see a systemic emerging market debt crisis in horizon unless these financial conditions really get tighter and we end up with a credit crunch in advanced economies. The big challenge in emerging developing economies centered around frontier markets, and you see some frontier markets having difficulties, and low-income countries. The big picture is that prior to the pandemic, this 2 decades, from 2000 to 2019, we had around 19 default episodes. Since 2020, we experienced 15 sovereign defaults.
Jeg får jo faen ikke åpna kontoen.
Debt distress in frontier markets, and half of low-income countries are in debt distress or high likelihood of falling into debt distress. When you have weak growth, when you have high interest rates, it is becoming more difficult to, of course, service the debt, and in some cases, you end up unable to pay the debt. Is this a systemic crisis? No. Is it a big problem, especially for frontier markets and low-income countries? Yes, no question about that.
And is that really why, even absent a crisis, why you see significantly lower growth in the second half of this year?
Jeg får jo ikke gjort noe. Helvete da.
You break out the different parts of it. You see emerging markets growing at just 4% below the 6% level that they grew in 2008 versus advanced economies, which are also going to be seeing slower growth, but perhaps not as slow as what was seen during the 2008 era. What's really driving all of this?
There are three important reasons. The first
Der krise, jeg får ikke lukka posisjonen min.
You have high interest rates. We are experiencing the steepest and fastest monetary policy tightening cycle at the global level over the past 40 years. The second reason is that inflation, as much as it is coming down, it is still high. So it
Har dere så tregt, eller hva med meg?
On the demand side. And the third reason, which we have already discussed, recent banking stress translated into tighter credit conditions.
Jeg kan ikke bruke 5 minutter for å lukke noe.
On activity. And when you think about most emerging market developing economies, including advanced economies that rely on trade, trade has been slowing very sharply around the world. When you put all of these together, you end up with this slowdown that has been underway during the past 2 years.
You see in the report that inflation is expected to remain higher for
Kjørte en til
longer.
short på
What
Nasdaq.
is your outlook for inflation in the second half of this year, especially taking into account those new OPEC oil cuts that we saw announced yesterday? And how do you think that bodes for Fed monetary policy? Should they be hitting the pause button here in June, or are more rate hikes required to bring inflation down?
So in the context of inflation, there are some good news, and there are some, I think, worrying signs still there. The good news is that in many countries, inflation has peaked, and global inflation has been coming down. Our projections suggest that will continue this year and the next year. But still, by the end of next year, we will have inflation at the global level at above 3%, implying that in many countries, inflation is going to be above central bank target rates. That means central banks are going to be on the defensive. So when you think about core inflation, there are worrying signs there. Core inflation appears to be quite persistent, is picking up actually in some advanced economies. And unless we see a sustained decline in core inflation, we do not expect central banks to change their monetary policy stance. With respect to OPEC recent cuts, in the big scheme of the slowdown we are seeing, it's difficult to imagine that will have a material impact on oil price. Our oil price forecast is around $80 this year and the next year. So we see the oil price is range bound on the upside, given this dominant slowdown at the global level.
Ian, we'll have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much for your insights. So appreciate it. Hope to speak with you again soon.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And that's Ian Kosa, Deputy Chief Economist of the World Bank. Julie, back to you.
Jennifer Schonberger, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Coming up, is there such a thing as a risk-free investment? Our next guest says when it comes to what banks are buying, not anymore. We're going to tell you what that is next. Like much of Wall Street jargon, market melt-up is something fancy that describes something pretty simple. This little bit here is what some market participants are referring to as a melt-up, the most recent leg of the rally.
What does a melt-up mean? You see, the market is discounting all these bearish headlines that we're talking about recently, and it still manages to exhibit some bullish price action. So not anything huge, but just kind of melting up.
It's just a Wall Street slang, essentially, for a market
to
go down. And it basically kind of pulls in skeptical investors. So imagine something sort of melting and it spreads as it keeps going. And that's what we're seeing.
After the high-profile collapse of SVB, Signature Bank, and First Republic, the stability of the U.S. banking system is still very much in question. The Wall Street Journal this week reported that large lenders in the U.S. may face a 20% increase in capital requirements in the aftermath. Risk weighting is one way that regulators keep tabs on the system, but in a recent piece, our next guest said there are no riskless assets anymore, and maybe there never were. Joining us now is John Heltman, American Banker's Washington Bureau Chief. And John, of course, my brain immediately goes to treasuries, right, which are sort of the classic riskless asset, but in fact turned out not to be riskless in a rising rate environment. So how should we as investors and media who covers it, how should regulators think about what's on bank balance sheets now?
Just to thank you for the question, and just to kind of like set the table for what we're talking about here. Bank capital is complex, right? So it's not just it's sort of reflected as like you need to have X capital, meet that in your good, which is kind of how it works, but there's lots of different ways of slicing and dicing capital. One of the sort of advents of the several recessions ago, or several bank crises ago, was the Basel Committee, and they introduced this concept of risk weighting assets. And that is sort of acknowledging that some assets are riskier than others, right? So if you are doing a strip mall in Cincinnati that has one kind of risk profile versus a mortgage versus a treasury security, right? And the idea is that you need to hold less capital or the capital you hold is commensurate with the risk of the underlying asset. But these that sort of risk profile metric has a pretty bad track record. And so to answer your question, like, you know, treasuries were the safe asset this time. If you go back about 10 years, it was sovereign debt. If you recall, in Europe, the sovereign debt crisis around 2011, mortgage-backed securities were seen as very riskless leading up to 2008. So my point with the piece was just that maybe we shouldn't assign zero risk weights to anything, because those things tend to get loaded up in the system and then tend to go boom.
So what does this mean for the broader environment in financial conditions right now?
I think that if policymakers were to take me up on my offer, well, the net effect would be higher capital requirements at banks, because right now there are things that they don't really have to retain capital against. Treasury is a good example. I mean, the most liquid thing in the world is cash, or supposed to be. But, you know, then again, we just got past a debt ceiling crisis that would have deeply affected the value of cash. So, like, as I said, nothing is really riskless.
If regulators sort of change capital requirements, or at least broaden the banks that would have to abide by certain capital requirements.
Her puls på shorten på Nasdaq. Tenker å holde den litt. Jeg tror vi må gå og teste på Emma her.
Assets kind of situation.
Well, I mean, not really. Like, yes and no. I think there's still a place for risk weighting to exist. It is still true that there are things that have higher risks relative to other things, and it is right for regulators to assign higher capital requirements for those things. And if you're a bank, you can decide for yourself how much risk appetite you have. And, you know, risk equals growth. So, like, if you don't take any risks, then you don't have any growth. So each bank can decide for itself, to some extent, you know, within reason, how much risk it wants to assume. But I think that the idea that there are some things that are just safe, it has a pretty bad track record. And those things, when things are considered safe and you don't have to hold capital against them, then it makes sense for you to hold more of those things. And when everyone's holding the same thing, those values can go up. And when that value exceeds the underlying kind of secular value of an asset, as we saw with treasuries, you know, banks got a bunch of deposits, needed something to do with it, and they put it in something safe, which is long-dated treasuries. The interest rate environment changed, and they found themselves underwater. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of the point there.
American Bankers Washington Bureau Chief John Heltman. John, always a pleasure to get some of your insights and perspective around the industry. Thanks so much for breaking this down for us.
Thank you.
Switching gears here, we got to talk C3 AI. It's ridden the hype around AI this year, with shares up over 200% year to date. But not everyone is on board. The AI company was the target of short seller Spruce Point Capital, highlighting potential concerns. Yahoo Finance's Ali Garfinkel spoke with Spruce Point Capital's management founder yesterday, and she joins us now. Hey, Ali.
Hi, Brad. So the job of a short seller, of course, is to question a stock. And I want to be careful here accordingly. However, I think it's important to give voice to some of short seller Ben Axler's concerns here, especially given that C3 AI's stock is up a staggering 230% as of the moment I sat down in this chair. The center of Axler's criticism really revolves around the idea of exaggeration. The idea that CEO Tom Siebel is exaggerating the company's revenue opportunities, partnerships, customer base. I asked Axler with Shauna Smith yesterday how far this goes. Here's what he had to say.
I'm not making allegations of that. That's beyond my means, but I am certainly making the claim that I believe there's a lot of puffery going on here. I think there's a lot of exaggeration about, again, the TAM, the addressable market, about how much money's been invested, and ultimately about the prospects for the business.
And Ben, I also want to ask, if we're not alleging fraud, then what do you want to see? What is your message to Tom Siebel?
I think the message is get the customer straight, okay? I mean,
we've
now seen multiple revisions about what they claim to be the customers.
So I tested this out this weekend. I didn't take Ben Axler at his word, and I spent a weekend with some 8Ks. And what I sort of found was that though C3 AI is very candid about who some of its most high-profile customers are, in a lot of cases, there's some linguistic gymnastics sort of surrounding how many customers there really are. Some examples from these filings, things like customer count is up year over year, or we closed 126 agreements, both of which are a little slippery. And I get that they're trying to show growth, and I really do think that there still could be more transparency. I was hoping to discuss this with C3 AI CEO Tom Siebel today on this show. He was scheduled to be here, but he canceled yesterday. I certainly am hoping for a reschedule, Brad.
As am I. We've talked to him before, so we'll see if we can get it organized once again. Thanks a lot, Ali. Appreciate it. Coming up, Rochelle Akufo has you for the next hour of trading. Stay tuned for a conversation with the CEO of JM Smucker. You're going to be back too, aren't you?
Yeah, CEO of Sprinkler. We've got that locked and loaded, ready to go.
Have a great day, everybody.
Welcome to Yahoo Finance Live. It's 11 a.m. on the East Coast, 8 a.m. on the West. I'm Rochelle Akufo. Here's a look at what I'm watching this morning. The gradual market melt-up continues this morning. This despite a lukewarm response from Apple investors after its big launch. Wall Street's top strategists are trying to make sense of all the moves. We break it all down for you coming up this hour. And Morgan Stanley warning a sharp profit dip could derail the S&P 500 from its highs. This after Citi said you shouldn't lose sight of a potential pain trade from AI. Our financial advisor will help you look past the noise and position your portfolio. And the SEC is suing Coinbase, alleging the crypto exchange operator evaded regulations by trading unregistered securities. This a day after it took legal action against rival Binance and its CEO CZ. Is this a war on crypto? We'll discuss. But first, let's take a look at how the major indices are faring an hour and a half into the trading day. Picking up the pace here, we're within the red for most of the morning, but now turned positive. The Dow there up about 50 points on the day. The S&P 500 there also buoyed by about 0.25%. Similar situation, up by about 0.25% as well. The Nasdaq, well, that's around 34 points. Let's also check in on the action we're seeing in the Treasury market as well. Some of that uncertainty seeming to weigh off, seeing people willing to take a bit more risk here. The 5-year up about 0.8%, the 10-year also up about 0.6%, and the longest term 30-year yield there up just barely there, 0.15%. Well, AI hype has driven tech stocks higher so far this year, with Nvidia, of course, leading the way, up over 100% year to date. And Citi analysts say this boom could continue. Here to break this down for us, our very own Jared Blickery. So, Jared, before we get to tech, let us know what's happening in the crypto market, of course, following all of the news this morning.
I'm glad you asked, because I do have our crypto heat map up here. Coinbase got served, and you can see Bitcoin down about 3%. The SEC going after them, saying that they were selling unregistered securities, I believe acting as an unregistered broker-dealer. This comes only a day after a very similar suit filed against CZ and Binance, at least Binance US here. Here is a chart of the year-to-date of Bitcoin, and we can see a little bit of a downdraft here yesterday, but I think what stands out here, we're still in the upper about 1/3 of its trading range for the year. This is still an intermediate uptrend that we're looking at right now, with these series of lower highs and lower lows. We are now in the short-term downtrend. 25,000. Or roughly speaking,
så plutselig funket ikke TD på 5 minutter, alt var
crypto from this, I think,
ja, men TD var fett rart I dag.
Said that if the SEC had its way of regulating everything the way they said
they were going to, in theory, it'd be very difficult for them to be in business.
So this is a life or death struggle here. The SEC has done more against crypto. I think a lot of the bad news is already out, but
står det på TradingView hvor mange prosenter det
Ja, på TradingView så har du et measure key, så du kan bare flytte over.
Høres 10 ganger bedre ut.
That's about all I have on the crypto front.
Så jeg kan for eksempel se
Coinbase
Hvis jeg har lyst til å se hvor mye vi har beveget oss I dag, så sånn her, trykker på measure, og så velger den bunncandlen fra tidligere, og så flytter han opp til toppcandlen, og så kan jeg si at vi har beveget oss I en kanal på 0,7% I dag på Nasdaq.
Their big theme is really concentration risk, and that's something that we've been talking a lot about.
Here's
what's going on in the market today. We have the Nasdaq up 28 basis points, not a lot. Dow up about half of that, but really the story has been the mega caps.
Fikk du med deg DNB-fondet?
Is real. Whether you consider the top 7
Nei, de betta jo på Viaplay-tallene.
Something 8.
Ja, de gjorde 100 mil på en dag.
Over the last month, some incredible statistics here, but the big question on everybody's minds, can this continue and for how long? We've seen concentration risk survive for over a year, maybe a year and a half in 1999 to 2000 in the tech bubble. These things can be irrational, but they can also stay solvent. Important to remember. So these things have momentum. Sometimes they just feed on themselves. I'm going to do a quick technical analysis on Apple because I think it's still relevant to what we're dealing with right here. Apple is overextended, and it just barely managed to poke above its all-time high yesterday.
DNB Asset Management.
Apple is a bellwether stock. This tells me maybe it wants to pause.
Var det short?
DNB eller TMT? Ja, I'm short.
If it just takes off, guess what? These other mega caps probably going to go along with it. So the Nasdaq, and there's your pain trade.
De har en short-posisjon på 750 000
aksjer. There you have it. Jared Blickery there with that great breakdown there for us. Thank you so much. Well, joining us now with some tips to set your portfolio up for success. Phillips, EP Wealth Advisors Managing Director.
Netflix har bare tatt over alt som
Thank you for joining me this morning. So, I mean, we're seeing how equities have been faring so far this year. A lot of people wondering, though, what are the red flags we should be looking for when you do have
knuse Disney, knuse HBO, knuse Prime?
You know, I think that's a great question. We're talking about the fact that
Men Viaplay skal strømme mest, skal strømme mye. Det som tatt på Viaplay var jo ikke strømmetjenesten seg selv, det var jo filmtjenesten og det som konkurrerer med Netflix, for der slår de ikke. Men de har jo under Premier League og alt det der greiene, så det får de ikke på Netflix. Som Premier League og Formel 1 og alt det der som de har, det har vi Viaplay.
Fikk fra de gutta nede I England og sånt nå, så det driver og solgt sånn ulovlig streaming til 50 000 abonnenter. Fikk 10 år hver I fengsel.
Det en sak det.
So then as you look at the broader equities market then, what are you honing in on?
Sure, well, you know, we're
looking at
some of those players outside of the technology space.
Obviously, AI
has really driven a lot of the strength there.
Alt ifra 5 til 21 år.
5 år til 21 år.
5 til 21, ja.
Så første gang han har drept noen da, var litt uheldig.
Det var litt uheldig, det kommer an på, er det et aktsomt drap, så det minste du kan sette på er vel 12 år, 12-13 år. Og så et uaktsomt drap, så har du et ganske stort spekter utifra graden av aktsomhet.
Det er ganske sykt at økonomisk kriminalitet er så å si på linje med sånn sinnssykt som det er.
Ja, og så kjenner jeg litt an på den økonomiske kriminaliteten du bedriver da, for det er jo sånn at det er en økonomisk kriminalitet som ruiner, la oss si, 500 000 stykker, så du ødelegger livet til så mange mennesker da.
Se på S&P, ja.
S&P grønt, 0,2.
Ja, nå ramler. Jeg mener Dow.
How we'd actually see the use cases for some of this technology.
S&P beholdt litt igjen av Nasdaq.
Revised down in the upcoming
Ja, nå kommer
How should
det ned, ja.
people be positioning their portfolios so that they can try and take advantage of some of these AI companies that do have some legs and some of the ones that they should perhaps be more cautious on?
Well, you know, when you talk about AI, I think it's so interesting because, you know, this is a theme that
Det er sjukt at over 60% av verdien på Viaplay forsvant på en dag.
as revolutionary as many are hoping.
Det er vilt.
And so I think it means it's going to be tough to pick a winner. I think if people want to play that theme, you want to focus on diversification as opposed to choosing that one winning horse. Within our portfolios, we are, you know, we do have exposure to some of those larger names that are often discussed. Some of those that have been more of the high-flying names, but
Jeg tror Dow Jones kan falle til det også.
right now we are mindful that some of these
Oljefondet eide jo 8,1% av aksjene i Viaplay da, så
as far as being a good entry point, you know, we'd be a little bit more
så de har jo fått på en liten smell der.
Nei, men det som er med oljefondet, de må bare eie alt. De må eie absolutt alt på Oslo Børs.
within our portfolios is diversification. So
Men er ikke Viaplay, ikke dem på den svenske børsen?
De må bare eie. De må plassere alt overalt.
Today's leading story, which is really
Oljefondet trender jo ikke. De kjøper bare posisjoner.
I think many would look to the
Prosenter i sektorer. Ja, vi må ha 2% til det, 3% til det, og så bare sitter de på det.
They're missing out on something. And so what we're trying to educate our clients about is that
Naturgass
has
popper
proven
opp
time and time again that it's about
1,83%
diversifying your
opp i
portfolio.
dag.
It's okay to have some exposure to some of those names that may be the
Mens
beneficiaries
Dow
of that
tryner.
theme. But don't forget about the rest of the market because that really is just a small subset of the broader market.
And what do you see as some of the biggest risks to the S&P in the
Jeg
back
så
half?
shorte mer, men tør ikke.
Talk about the pain trade potentially of AI if you get, you know, over.
Jeg nekter å tro at den nye Vision Pro-greien til Apple blir å være så bra som de viste i det forbannet presentasjonen sin.
Might have some more rate hikes ahead as well. And
Håper Viaplay går konkurs.
I think the Fed is still
Kanskje vi endelig kan få MMA-en og Formel 1 på en annen plass, så det er billigere.
behind us. I think it's just back to the basics that we've been living with for.
Jeg har sett på DNB som yrkesportfølge, siste som følger. Men DNB suger da.
We are going to be watching China and U.S. relations very, very closely. You know, next week we have the FOMC meeting, the June meeting, and we believe that the Fed is likely to pause.
Jeg registrerte meg at det er banken
What we're going to be
starter.
interested in is whether they signal a pause or I
Kan
guess what we
banken.
call a skip,
Legger ut seg.
whether they're going to provide language implying that this is not a pause in which the next move would be a cut in rates,
And
but
then
whether
nice.
they're actually going to just take this meeting off, wait for some more information before proceeding with possibly additional rate hikes in the July meeting. And so I think there's a lot for us to remain.
Jeg er sikker på at det ikke er 3 steg på den der kontoen forresten, for det er mange andre kjører med.
Sa jeg 2?
Ja.
Jeg mener det er 2, kanskje det er 3. Steg 1 er ferdig, steg 2 er ferdig nå.
Projections are likely to move lower as time goes on here. And analysts and corporations start to
Ja, hvis steg 2 er ferdig, det er bare 1 steg, skulle vi få den, men
realize some of the pressures that they're up against.
Fy faen.
especially if we do get that skip versus a pause. Thank you
Og
for
så
bringing
kommer
that
det
interesting
Vent da, hva
context
skjønner
there.
ikke man
Really
nå?
thank you there. Adam Phillips, EP Wealth Advisors, Managing Director
Jævla
of Portfolio
fuckings
Strategy.
idiot.
Thank you for your time this morning. Right, taking a look at Shopify stock popping
Okay,
today
så det
on
er
news that
egentlig
the sale of its logistics business to Flexport has been completed. As part of the sale, Shopify gets stock representing 13% equity interest in Flexport, which adds to the partnership the two companies created when Spotify invested in Flexport's Series E round in February of 2022. Now, Shopify stock has been booming year to date, up almost 80%, just above 80%, as the company has cut jobs and focused on its main quest of providing e-commerce software to businesses. So enjoying some growth there today. Right, coming up, why hopeful homeowners are facing bigger hurdles for pricier homes. Plus, what the world's changing climate means for the US real estate landscape. That's coming up next.
Så før jeg har sett og trade med det der jævla det der Apple-driten på hodet. Faen, du må bli svimmel. Du har mutet mikken, tror jeg.
Faen, sorry.
Ja. Hva du skulle svare til det?
Trade med...
Det der Apple Vision Pro-greieren.
Ja, det så bare helt teit ut.
Setter en slalombrille innendørs.
Så kostet det mye hva det kostet? Kostet skjorta i helvete.
35 case.
Ja. Kommer bra ned på S&P. Jeg tror Dow Jones kommer til å gå på day low dag, skjønner du. Og Nasdaq holder seg kunstig høyt. Jeg får lyst til å shorte Nasdaq her, ass. Det er så jævla dumt, for den kan gå opp, vet du. Den kan gå opp som en hedge mot resten. Fuck it. Jeg går short. Helvetes dritt av fuckings indeks. Jeg er short nå. Angrer allerede.
Angrer allerede.
Jeg vil egentlig ikke ta den, men den er så dum at den må bare komme ned.
Lenders are losing their appetite for originating mortgages on pricier homes. Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Danny Romero to give us a temperature check on the mortgage market. So, Danny, for our viewers, explain what a jumbo loan is and how this all ties in.
So a jumbo loan is a loan that is too large to be backed by the government. It also varies depending on the state.
Hvis den der Apple Pro-greia faktisk, eller Vision Pro-greia faktisk leverer alt den lover i denne presentasjonen, så er det ganske sjukt hvor vilt hopp i teknologi det er. Altså i den der linsa som du setter og ser i, så er det mer piksler enn i en 8K-TV.
For borrowers, there are fewer options. So this could be a positive for borrowers. They can negotiate better terms.
Ja, det koster penger da.
Ja, men da tidlig, det er sånn 35K for hvor mye betaler ikke folk for sånne her ultra-HD-TV-er i dag for å bære seg på TV, liksom.
6.78% for the last week of May. And if we compare that to the conforming loan for the 30-year fixed rate,
it's around 6.9%. So that spread is a little bit
Tim
narrower
Cook
now.
says he uses
So this
ChatGPT
leads
and
to
that
some
Apple is
experts
looking at it
really
closely.
concerned about liquidity. Some lenders are also artificially pricing these loans to be worse so that they
Kom nå ned da! Hva det dette amerikanske søppelmarkedet driver med?
demand for it as well, weaken that demand there. But again, jumbo loans generally sit on the bank's balance sheet since they're not backed by the government, and they also have higher fees. So the end result, the conclusion here, Rochelle, is that it's going to be a tough market for both the lender and the borrower.
Certainly a tough time indeed as people try and navigate this space. Thank you for breaking that down for us, our very own Danny Romero. Well, scientists warn that extreme weather events, wildfires, floods and storms are expected to worsen as a result of climate change. Those types of natural disasters threaten cities across the US and could take a toll on their economic prosperity. Recently, insurance industry giants Allstate and State Farm announced they will no longer issue new policies in California, saying that increasing wildfire risks make the nation's most populous state too expensive to cover. Joining me now is David Calloway, Calloway Climate Insights founder and editor-in-chief. Thank you for joining me this morning. So I first want to start with this uninsurable trend that we're seeing in places like California here. What does that signal if you're a homeowner or you're a business and you're trying to decide where you'd like your business to be?
Den var en buy-block kom gjennom da fra 14.566 ned til 14.557.
This is a trend. Last week was a big week and really a watershed moment in climate finance because it's the time when kind of obscure concerns about what climate change might do in the future come right home and hit everyone who
Så det er lov den jævlen der. Og jeg er pluss på Nasdaq short, men den også må da komme ned da. Folk må våkne opp og skjønne at det går til helvete.
Really creates a difficult time in the market. State law doesn't require you to have insurance on your homes, but most mortgage covenants do. So people are going to be scrambling to get insurance. This is climate change coming down to personal level.
Dette her holdes kunstig oppe av en hel haug med botter, marketmakere og amatører. Når det da knekker nå, så skal det knekke så jævlig. Da er det frykt som rår. Og da er det sånn, selg! Selg!
So this is, you can't overstate how important those two announcements were. They've been moving towards it for a while. Those people, neighbors of ours who live in the mountains and stuff, were finding their homes were uninsurable. But now to say across the whole state, that's big. We're seeing it in Florida. We're seeing it in Louisiana. All coastal states.
Da er litt støtte her. Hvis den bryter ned her nå, så sier det bye-bye.
At some point. And so the crunch is beginning in the finance from climate change.
And you mentioned the three states where we tend to see this. I mean, California, Florida, Louisiana, which are usually the states that you think of when you think of the biggest exposures to climate risk, whether it's wildfires, hurricanes, or flooding. But in terms of where you're also seeing the biggest drops in home values in these coastal cities from these climate effects, what are the standouts?
Well, absolutely. I mean, some places like in the Florida Keys and in various parts of the Bay Area here that are right on the beach, homeowners have been told essentially by their towns and their counties, look, we're not going to be able to support you by building seawalls and building out stilts for your homes and stuff. Essentially, you're going to have to move at some point. And so that, the great climate migration we've been fearing for a long time is something we're going to start to see here. So that affects homes as well. It's crazy though, Rochelle. People are still coming out here. They're still looking for homes on the beach. Phoenix, which has a severe water shortage and heat above 100 degrees, 100 days, it's a summer. It's still seeing record numbers of inflows from retirees and people looking for sun. So, I'm not sure anyone's getting the message, but these types of things with insurance companies and mortgages and home loaners, it starts to spread the message. Next step, obviously, economic impact on the cities and counties and states. That's going to affect their municipal bonds. That's going to affect their borrowing.
Ta snart gevinsten min i Nasdaq. Folk er så jævla skadeskutt i huet, altså.
So So then, when people are trying to look for more climate resilient cities, obviously those are going to start looking a lot more attractive. Where are you seeing some of this climate migration starting to go?
Well, that's a great question, Michelle. Years ago,
That's a great question, Michelle.
the staff, pretty much the whole staff, I said, I want to do
Han ser ut som Homer Simpson, han kameraten der. Må ikke høre på han.
on what climate change looks like in every part of the country. And I want us to
Han,
find out where the
Meet Kevin, han
safest
jo
part of the country
superbull da.
is. Hurricane Florida has its hurricanes.
Meet Kevin, da. Han har ikke noe valg, han er politiker.
Freezing cold in the north.
Han jo ikke politiker nå lenger.
Han var det I hvert fall.
Where's the safest place?
Han var oppe og pult til Tesla, så det spruta etter.
And they determined about 10 years ago that it was Salt Lake City, Utah. No
Han
problem.
Ricky, han har solgt seg ut av TKQQ, og så setter han vent på å droppe I Nasdaq nå og short.
Samme som meg, da.
So even Salt Lake gets hit. A lot of people now are talking, you see, it's fashionable to talk about Duluth, Minnesota. With all apologies to my relatives in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Duluth is no person's place of somewhere you want to live. It's very cold in the winter. But they're saying it's paradise in 20 years with climate change because the winters will be warmer.
Sitter fortsatt med 2 små kontrakter.
And there'll be no devastating wild.
Short på S&P videre.
So I think you're going to see more stories like this.
Jeg kommer snart tilbake.
The Duluths of the world, not just in the U.S., but everywhere. As you start to see a migration, we're not seeing it yet because the economy is still fairly good historically, and climate change hasn't had that much of an impact yet. But when we start to see these insurance moves, this means the financial markets are paying attention to it, and it's beginning.
Now, of course, when we think of environmental investing, you think of ESG investing as well. But when you think of a state like Florida, when you have Governor DeSantis, who could potentially end up being president of the United States, what do you think the future holds then for ESG investing, and what that perhaps turning point will be for it to be taken more seriously?
Well, DeSantis's move against ESG is really a head shaker. I mean, obviously, it's a political move. He's taking advantage of the kind of anti-woke culture wars that we're seeing playing out across the country to put ESG in there because Florida is on one of the front lines of climate change. DeSantis' record actually on environmental stuff is not that bad. He's done a lot to protect Florida's resiliency. But when it comes to kind of talking about ESG and national attempts by essentially state pension funds like the Florida Pension Fund or Texas Pension Fund to hedge against the risks of climate change on their properties and on their investments in their states for their retirees, attacking that is really just shooting yourself in the foot. Of course, the danger is if this goes national, it could become a national crisis. I mean, the GOP is already suing in federal court to overturn a Biden law, which was brought in to essentially offset a Trump law that said you can't regard environmental risks when investing. So the GOP is going after this on a federal level already. DeSantis is going to use it as a club in his election campaign. And Trump really, kind of laughed off climate change. He joked about it. DeSantis is really putting himself in the position of climate denier in chief, and he's going to make it an issue in his campaign. Whether it actually, resolutes with anybody, I don't know. But it's certainly affecting how Wall Street thinks about ESG investing right now.
Certainly worth keeping in mind. Lots of great insights there. Do appreciate you joining me this morning, David Calloway, Calloway Climate Insights founder and editor-in-chief. Thank you so much. All right, coming up, the founder and CEO of Sprinkler joins us to discuss the latest round of earnings and how the company is continuing its growth drive. Don't miss it.
Du dato som faen. Så du fallet, eller?
Giv da.
Hæ?
Ja da, jeg ser til å se på.
Her er penger på Dow Jones shortman, for å si det sånn. Takk skal du ha, Tobias. Og jeg penger på Nasdaq-shorten hvert øyeblikk. Den siste Nasdaq-shorten. Jeg har bare penger her nede. Jeg tror ikke folk skjønner hvor mye ned jeg skal nå. Jeg tror folk helt blendende. Folk forstår det ikke. Folk skjønner ikke finans, ass.
Ja, men nå det enda mer sånn her. Nå det så mye mindre permabears der ute. Folk vet jo faen ikke hva han skal tro.
Grattis, Tobias!
Hvorfor coveret du ikke når du gikk i day low, forresten?
Hæ?
Hvorfor coveret du ikke på day low?
Fordi jeg var ute og vaske opp. Det er problemet mitt. Jeg får ikke sitte der hele tiden, for jeg må ut og hente bikkjene og vaske opp og kukke og styre. Og som er bort nå, til regnskapsfører om 10 minutter, det er jo helt krise, sånn som jeg holder på.
Ja, da må du være ute.
Kunne jo tjent 10 ganger så mye hvis jeg bare kunne sitte her.
Hvorfor må du fysisk til regnskapsfører?
Ikke spør meg. Jeg tror jeg har en ubrukelig regnskapsfører. Eller jeg vet hun har det. Hun har faen ikke levert en regnskap i tide en gang.
Jeg sendte deg en chart på Discorden. Traff ganske bra på de blokkene der.
Og du driver og ser på de blokkene dine, du?
Ja. Jeg driver og skal se på å begynne å trade Forex, vet du, så da må jeg se litt mer inn på liquidity og...
Ok, så de røde strekene av blokkene?
De røde strekene er sell-blocks, altså der ligger det inne salgsordre, og de grønne blokker ligger inne kjøpsordre.
Er det reelle salg, eller hva den tror?
Den jeg har basert på metrics av der du har altså order blocks, når det tidligere har vært en blokkordre til selgsida eller kjøpsida på samme nivå.
Så det er ikke ordrebøker sånn som man kunne se før i tida?
Nei, den tar på en måte når du har hatt en order sell tidligere på et nivå, hvis det har skjedd på flere nivå, så tror de at da ligger en institusjonell selger eller kjøper på de aktuelle nivåene.
Det er der det er historisk data han ser på.
Ja, det er der det er historisk data som tyder på at du enten har en sterk kjøper eller en sterk selger. Så den treffer ganske bra ganske ofte.
year-over-year growth of 20%, and subscription revenues came in higher. Growth percentage was higher.
Det er en ganske kul strategi på Forex, tenkte jeg da. Når jeg begynner med det.
We also posted $11 million of non-GAAP operating
income. Så det kan vi stille.
I think what the street was also paying close attention to.
Han har bra bounce på den her da.
Han slår på nytt nå, men jeg tør ikke.
Tipper du kan få han opp på Dowen, tipper du kan få opp på 33,619 før han kanskje retrace ned igjen, med mindre han blir bounce av EMA-en her, eller blir rejected av EMA-en, mener jeg, beklager.
Well, it was cool to connect with, the few hundred customers I was able to connect and talk to in the last several 12 months. What we are hearing consistently.
Jeg tror jeg har knekt koden på indeksen nå, altså.
Now, keep in mind, these are some of the largest companies in the world. What we are hearing.
Med tanke på antall kontrakter jeg må ha for å overleve. Jeg har gjort det dritbra nå, i 2 uker.
Ja, ikke så lenge du har marginer til konsept, så vet du retningen du skal gjøre.
Jeg treffer jo hele tiden.
You're talking about large businesses that have multiple business units, some case like 40, 50, 60 business units, which are large companies in of itself. Each business unit operates in, 50, sometimes 100 markets. And in each market, they're doing customer service, they're doing marketing, they're doing advertising, they're doing voice of customer surveys and insights and sales. And And in marketing,
Jeg tror dere får ras ned på
they're using 5 to 15 channels. And now think about a consumer or a customer of that brand on the other side. It's cacophony. It's impossible for a large company to stay on brand and create consistent brand messaging across all these channels, across all these functions, across all these markets, and across all these business units. And we have stuffed the front office with somewhere between 50 and 75 point solutions on an average, almost in every function. It's unsustainable because they don't talk to each other. You can't see the customer.
Må gjennom motstand her nå.
So I'll give you the example of a large credit card company whose contact center we just replaced and upgraded with Sprinklr. Before Sprinklr, if you email the agent, the email customer service agent was just unable to use any other channel. So if you ask for a credit limit increase on email, you had to wait for the customer to respond back. If you ask now, you hit the phone button. Hey, sir, can you provide your supporting evidence for your income? And then boom, the case that would have taken a week now takes 20 minutes.
Allah, kjekken. Skal jeg komme nå, eller?
On the productivity front, that's a huge benefit for some of these companies. And on that topic of productivity, what we've continued to hear and track over the course of this earnings season is any mention of artificial intelligence and generative AI. When you think about your own business, I see you smiling, I see you laughing at this one, but at the end of the day, investors also want to know, all right, for a company that has a founder CEO like Raji Thomas, how you're thinking about generative AI with some of the existing Sprinklr framework and where that could potentially benefit some of your customers that are looking for better productivity.
Right, that's a great question coming from you. I'm sure you recall that we had almost 7 pages describing our artificial intelligence in our IPO prospectus. So first off, AI is something that we've been talking about, and our entire platform has been built on for the last 5 years, and it's a core differentiator for Sprinklr. Let me just help everybody understand the way we see AI and what we see happening now. Yes, there's a lot of buzz about generative AI now. There's plenty of companies that are jumping in, introducing product SKUs, and most of them are doing something very simple. They have a developer or a small team making a call to an OpenAI API and putting the results back, and it looks cool. Let me tell you what the problem is. If you don't control the data set that the AI is trained on, if you're training your AI models on unbound data sets, your results, your outcome is going to be unpredictable. In the enterprise world, we now have countries that are running on Sprinklr. Qatar government cannot afford to have Coca-Cola, Microsoft, McDonald's, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, they can't afford to have unpredictable outcomes in the front office. It has to be on brand, it has to be compliant. So there's a lot more rigor. You can't afford when bot makes a mistake or ChatGPT makes a mistake, that's fun. It's a joke. But brands can't afford to do that. So what we have done for the last 5 years is we have developed over 2,000 models. Actually, hundreds of models custom done for customers. And these models have been trained on pretty much all
Hvis du zoomer litt ut på Nasdaqen, så har den egentlig en litt sånn den er sakte, men stigende trend der med det ser ut sånn. Så jobber han seg jo noe sakte. Hvis den lowen der nå er lowen. Så blir han jo også opp dette litt ned igjen, så blir han være enda høyere enn den var, og så videre. Så det kan hende det ender helt sidelengs i dag, ellers så tryner det. Det er noe dumt.
Ja, jeg skal tryne. Det skal tryne, halleluja. Men begge to er jo akkurat på 17 år da.
So we're seeing 300% increase in adoption of that feature with generative AI. But there are like
Netflix har faen meg gått 44% i mars.
for our AI capability.
So Roger, in terms of the growth story from here, I mean, I know you opened a new R&D hub in India as well, but on the other hand, you have regulators sort of really trying to figure out how they can put some guardrails around AI. How do you sort of focus on the growth story while keeping
We are very, very, very early in the AI revolution. It's going to be a quantum leap. I think I'm a fan of responsible AI. I think we've seen this in crypto. We've seen this in social. I think we should come up with frameworks very early on and not wait for game-changing technology like AI to grow without control. And then you're going to have a lot of companies go out of business because people get just pumped up, and a lot of people lose money. And so I'm a fan of responsible AI. I'm a fan of common sense.
Jeg tror AI er noe av det verste jeg har gjort noen gang.
Like Sprinkler and Google and Facebook and
Hva sier du, tror
AI, jeg tror det er noe av det verste vi har gjort. Det er så genialt at hvis du kommer i feil hender, så kan du faen meg gjøre mye gærent, ass.
Det er allerede blitt testet hvor mye gærent du kan gjøre noe med AI.
We're going to be at Cannes Lions speaking with a range of chief marketing officers, perhaps
Nå kommer shortmen i penga igjen.
you work with as well, and I'm wondering, even as we're thinking about the impending economic downturn that has been widely telegraphed, can advertising do enough to get some of these companies through the other side, or to generate enough demand to get companies through a downturn? And we only have about 30 seconds.
We're spot on. There's a pull back on advertising and marketing spend. People are stepping back to see how it shakes out before spending again. The good news is we have put about 80% of our energy into our contact center product, which is like taking off. And our thesis that we bring customer service
Jeg må stikke til regnskap. Jeg skulle sitte, eller?
so we can
Skal vi la chatten være?
into sales.
Hvis du er ferdig, så skal du bare gå bra. Jeg skal legge meg, for jeg skal på nattvakt. Så jeg skal sove et par timer. Og så skal jeg...
For jeg er short fortsatt, og så skal jeg er short alt her nå. Så jeg logger meg på litt senere i dag.
Ja, jeg står kanskje opp og sjekker før du...
Thank you both. Talk soon.
Før jeg stikker på jobb, hvordan det går.
All right, coming up, MasterCard is doubling down on its commitment to financial inclusion. Find out how next.
Ok, boys, ses etterpå.